The needle slipped, drawing blood from Kate Sullivan's finger as the church bells tolled midnight in Bitter Creek. She'd been sewing by candlelight for 14 hours straight, her eyes burning from strain, her back aching from hunching over. Delicate lacework that would grace another woman's wedding dress. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, a widow whose own marriage had lasted barely 2 years before consumption claimed her husband, now spent her nights crafting dreams for brides who wouldn't even meet her eyes on the street. At 32, Kate had become invisible in a town that prided itself on seeing everything. Her red hair, once vibrant as autumn leaves, had dulled to rust from years of malnutrition and worry. Her hands, strong from endless needlework, bore calluses that told stories of survival no one cared to hear. The seamstress shop that should have been her sanctuary had become her prison, its walls closing in tighter each month as debts mounted and customers dwindled. Outside her single window, Bitter Creek slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, unaware that in the morning, everything would change. Unaware that a half Lakota scout named Joseph Crowfeather was riding toward town with news that would shake the foundations of their carefully ordered world. And completely unaware that the woman they called Unwanted was about to discover just how much fight lived beneath her worn exterior. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Bitter Creek as Kate Sullivan swept the front step of her seamstress shop for the third time that week. It was a ritual born of desperation rather than cleanliness, a way to appear busy when potential customers passed by. Most walked on without a glance, their eyes sliding past her as if she were part of the weathered wooden storefront itself. Kate understood her place in the careful hierarchy of Bitter Creek. She existed in the spaces between respectability and destitution, useful enough to mend torn sleeves and hem children's dresses, but never quite acceptable enough to be invited to the social gatherings where such services were discussed. Her late husband Thomas had left her with more debts than dignity, and Mayor Harrison Blackwood made sure she never forgot either. The bell above her door chimed with the listless sound of brass that had lost its shine, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Dorothy Hendricks, the self-appointed moral guardian of Bitter Creek's social order. Dorothy's steel-gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the perpetual frown lines around her mouth into sharp angles of disapproval. She carried herself with the authority of a woman whose husband owned the largest dry goods store in town and whose opinions carried weight in church circles. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dorothy's voice held the chill of a Wyoming winter morning, "I trust you've completed the alterations on my daughter's traveling dress." Kate nodded, retrieving the carefully pressed garment from behind the counter. She had spent hours taking in the waist and adjusting the sleeves, work that paid barely enough to keep her in thread and candles. The hem needed significant work, Mrs. Hendricks. The original seamstress had cut it unevenly. Dorothy examined the dress with the intensity of a jeweler inspecting a suspected fake diamond. Her fingers traced the new seams, searching for any imperfection that might justify reducing the agreed-upon payment. "I suppose it will suffice, though I notice the stitching isn't quite as fine as what we might expect from a more established seamstress." The words hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Kate had learned to swallow such insults along with her pride, but each one left a bitter taste that no amount of weak coffee could wash away. She wrapped the dress in brown paper with hands that remained steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "That will be $2, Mrs. Hendricks." Dorothy placed exactly $1.50 on the counter, the coins falling with tiny metallic protests. "I believe this reflects the quality of the work performed. You understand?" Kate understood perfectly. She understood that Dorothy Hendricks could reduce her payment by 25% with impunity because Kate had no recourse. No husband to defend her interests, no family connections to protect her business. She understood that accepting the reduced payment meant another week of thin soup and darn stockings, but refusing it meant losing even this meager income. "Of course," Kate replied, her voice steady as granite. "Will there be anything else?" Dorothy's smile held all the warmth of a rattlesnake's warning. "Actually, there is a matter I wish to discuss. The Church Ladies' Auxiliary has been concerned about your situation. A woman alone, struggling to maintain proper standards. Some have suggested it might be time to consider more suitable arrangements." Kate's hands stilled on the brown paper. "Suitable arrangements?" "Mrs. Whitmore in Cheyenne runs a very respectable boarding house for women of limited means. She provides structure, supervision, and honest work in exchange for room and board. It might be just the thing for someone in your circumstances." The offer wrapped around Kate's throat like a noose disguised as a silk scarf. She knew exactly what Dorothy was suggesting: surrender her independence, abandon her shop, and become a charity case under someone else's roof. Trade the dignity of her own business, however meager, for the safety of supervised poverty. "I appreciate the concern, Mrs. Hendricks, but I'm quite content with my current arrangements." Dorothy's eyebrows rose like twin peaks of incredulity. "Content? My dear woman, look around you. This place is falling apart, your customers are few, and your reputation among the decent families is hardly flourishing. Pride is a sin, Mrs. Sullivan, and it often leads to a fall harder than humility might have cushioned." The door chimed again, saving Kate from the necessity of a response that might have cost her what little standing she retained in Bitter Creek's commercial circles. Sheriff Tom Bradley entered, his badge catching the morning light streaming through the dusty window. Tom was a fair man trapped in an unfair situation, caught between enforcing the law and maintaining the peace with the town's most influential citizens. "Morning, ladies." Tom touched the brim of his hat with the practiced courtesy of a man who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of small-town politics. "Mrs. Hendricks, Mrs. Sullivan." Dorothy straightened her already rigid posture. "Sheriff Bradley, how timely. I was just discussing Mrs. Sullivan's situation with her. Perhaps you could speak to the wisdom of accepting help when it's offered in Christian charity." Tom's eyes moved between the two women, reading the tension like tracks in soft earth. He had been sheriff long enough to recognize when Dorothy Hendricks was circling someone with predatory intent, and his weathered face reflected the uncomfortable position of a man caught between duty and conscience. "I'm sure Mrs. Sullivan is capable of making her own decisions about her circumstances, Mrs. Hendricks. She's always been a responsible member of our community." The words were diplomatically neutral, but Kate heard the subtle support in Tom's tone. It was more than most people in Bitter Creek had offered her since Thomas's death 3 years earlier, and she felt a flicker of gratitude toward the man who tried to balance justice with the impossible demands of keeping peace. Dorothy's lips pursed into a thin line of displeasure. "Responsibility, Sheriff, sometimes requires accepting reality. But I suppose some people must learn hard lessons through hard experience." She gathered her package and swept toward the door with the dramatic flair of a woman who considered herself the heroine of every encounter. The bell's chime seemed almost relieved when she departed, leaving Kate and Tom in the sudden quiet of her absence. "She means well," Tom said finally, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words. Kate managed a smile that felt like lifting a weight. "I'm sure she does, Sheriff. Is there something I can help you with today?" Tom removed his hat and turned it in his hands, a gesture Kate recognized as his way of preparing for difficult conversations. "Actually, there is something you should know. We've got riders coming in from the territorial government, some kind of survey expedition. They'll be passing through within the next few days, maybe staying over depending on weather and supplies." "I see. And this concerns me how?" "Well, they'll need provisions, repairs, maybe some mending done." could mean good business for someone skilled with a needle. Tom paused, studying her face. But Kate, I have to warn you about something else. Harrison Blackwood has been asking questions about Thomas's outstanding debts again. He's been talking to folks about collection procedures. The floor seemed to shift beneath Kate's feet like quicksand. Thomas's debts to Mayor Blackwood had hung over her head like a sword suspended by a fraying thread for 3 years. The original amount had been substantial enough, but with interest compounding and penalties accruing, it had grown into a sum that might as well have been the national debt for all her ability to pay it. How much does he claim I owe now? Tom's hesitation told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. He's saying it's grown to nearly $300, Kate, with penalties and interest calculated from the original loan date. $300. Kate's annual income, if she was fortunate, barely reached $150. Even if she ate nothing but prairie grass and wore rags, she could never accumulate such a sum. It was a debt designed to be impossible, a financial trap that would eventually force her to surrender everything Thomas had left her. I see. Kate's voice remained steady through sheer force of will. And what are my options, Sheriff? Tom's weathered face creased with sympathy he couldn't afford to show too openly. Legally, he could claim your property as collateral. The shop, your personal possessions, everything. But Kate, I've been thinking there might be another way. If you could find someone willing to vouch for you, maybe co-sign a new arrangement. The suggestion trailed off because both of them knew how hollow it sounded. Who in Bitter Creek would risk their own financial standing to help a woman whose social currency was already worthless? Kate had no family connections, no wealthy friends, no romantic prospects who might be willing to assume responsibility for another man's debts. I appreciate the thought, Sheriff, but I think we both know that's not likely to happen. Tom nodded grimly, replacing his hat with the air of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to share. I'm sorry, Kate. I truly am. If there's anything I can do within the bounds of the law. You've been kinder than most, Sheriff Bradley. I won't forget that. After Tom left, Kate stood alone in her shop. Surrounded by bolts of fabric she couldn't afford to replace and projects that would never earn enough to save her from Harrison Blackwood's calculated financial strangulation. The morning sun had climbed higher, but the light seemed dimmer somehow, filtered through the dust and despair that seemed to settle over everything she touched. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She walked to the small mirror hanging beside her work table and studied her reflection with the same critical eye Dorothy Hendricks had used to examine the dress alterations. What she saw was a woman who had been worn down by circumstances beyond her control, but who still possessed something harder to destroy than reputation or financial security. In her green eyes, behind the fatigue and worry, something stubborn remained. Something that refused to accept that this was how her story would end. The bell chimed again, and Kate turned, expecting another customer with complaints or demands. Instead, she found herself facing a woman she had never seen before. Someone whose presence seemed to bring a different quality of air into the shop. The stranger was clearly of mixed heritage, with long black hair braided with colorful ribbons, and wearing a dress that combined European cut with Native American beadwork in intricate patterns around the sleeves and collar. "You are the seamstress Kate Sullivan?" the woman asked, her English accented but clear. "I am. How can I help you?" "My name is Mary Littlefoot. I come from the Crow Feather Camp north of here. We have heard of your skill with needle and thread, and we have need of such skill." Kate felt her pulse quicken with something she had almost forgotten: opportunity. "What kind of work are you looking for?" Mary approached the counter with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving confidently through the world. "We are preparing for winter trading, and we need repair work done on blankets, clothing, leather goods. Also, we have heard you might teach some of our women the European style of sewing. in exchange for learning our beadwork and quillwork techniques. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Work that might actually pay enough to matter, knowledge exchange that could expand her skills, and most importantly, customers who wanted her services rather than enduring them as a necessary inconvenience. I would be very interested in discussing such an arrangement, Kate said carefully. When would this work need to be completed? We would begin soon, but there is something else you should know. Mary's dark eyes studied Kate's face intently. My cousin Joseph Crow Feather is the scout and translator who guides the territorial survey teams. He will be arriving in Bitter Creek tomorrow with the government expedition. He has heard of your situation and has asked me to extend an invitation. Kate's breath caught. What kind of invitation? If you find Bitter Creek no longer suits your needs, there are other places where skilled hands and strong hearts are welcomed. Places where the color of your hair or the contents of your purse matter less than your willingness to work and your respect for others. The words carried implications that Kate hardly dared to examine too closely. The possibility of escape from Harrison Blackwood's financial trap, from Dorothy Hendrick's moral supervision, from the slow suffocation of a town that had decided she was expendable. I don't understand. Why would your cousin concern himself with my situation? Mary smiled, and for the first time in months, Kate saw genuine warmth directed toward her. Joseph believes that good people should not suffer because small minds cannot see past their own fears. He has seen what happens when communities turn their backs on those who need support rather than judgment. And he sent you to offer me. What exactly? A chance to see what lies beyond the borders of Bitter Creek. A chance to discover whether the life you have accepted is the only life available to you. Kate felt something shifting inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack under the pressure of spring warmth. For 3 years, she had accepted her diminished circumstances as the natural consequence of widowhood and poverty. She had believed that her choices were limited to gradual financial collapse or surrender to whatever charity the town's moral authorities deemed appropriate. When would I meet this cousin of yours? Tomorrow, when the survey expedition arrives. But Kate Sullivan, understand this. Joseph Crow Feather is a man who walks between two worlds, and not everyone in Bitter Creek will appreciate his interest in your welfare. There may be consequences to accepting his friendship. Kate looked around her shop once more, taking in the faded fabrics, the worn furniture, the careful economies that barely kept her afloat. Then she looked back at Mary Littlefoot, whose presence seemed to carry the promise of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Mrs. Littlefoot, I have been living with consequences for 3 years. At this point, I'm willing to risk new ones if they might lead somewhere different. Mary nodded as if Kate had passed some kind of test. Then prepare yourself, Kate Sullivan. Tomorrow your life begins to change. After Mary left, Kate found herself unable to concentrate on her sewing. She stood at her window watching the familiar rhythms of Bitter Creek's daily life and wondering if tomorrow would truly bring the change Mary had promised, or if hope was just another luxury she couldn't afford. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future felt like something other than a gradual descent into irrelevance. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Kate couldn't tell if they promised relief or simply a different kind of trouble. Either way, she thought, anything was better than the slow drought that had been killing her by degrees in the place she had once called home. The morning arrived with the sound of hoofbeats and jingling harness, a rhythmic percussion that drew curious faces to windows and doorways throughout Bitter Creek. Kate had been awake since before dawn, her hands trembling slightly as she braided her hair and smoothed her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better years but remained respectable. The anticipation that had kept her restless through the night now crystallized into nervous energy as she peered through her shop window at the approaching expedition. The survey team materialized through the morning dust like figures emerging from a mirage. There were 8 riders in total, most wearing the practical clothing of government men, accustomed to long days in the saddle. Their horses were sturdy rather than elegant, chosen for endurance over appearance, and their pack animals carried the tools and supplies of serious work. But it was the man riding slightly ahead of the others who captured Kate's attention and held it with magnetic force. Joseph Crow Feather sat his horse with the natural ease of someone who had been riding since childhood. His posture relaxed yet alert in the way of men accustomed to reading danger in landscape and weather. His features reflected his mixed heritage, strong cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing little. His hair fell to his shoulders, black as a moonless night, and he wore buckskin leggings beneath a wool shirt that had seen honest wear. Around his throat hung a necklace of carved bone and turquoise that caught the morning light like captured sky. Kate found herself studying his face with the intensity she usually reserved for intricate needlework, searching for clues to the character Mary Littlefoot had described. There was something in his expression that spoke of intelligence tempered by experience, kindness that had been tested but not hardened into cynicism. When his gaze swept across the storefronts and settled briefly on her window, she felt a jolt of connection that made her step back from the glass, heart hammering against her ribs. The expedition halted in front of the Broken Wheel Saloon, which also served as Bitter Creek's unofficial meeting hall for any business too important for the street. Kate watched as Joseph dismounted with fluid grace, his movements economical and purposeful. The other men gathered around him, clearly deferring to his knowledge of the territory despite his younger age. She could hear fragments of conversation carried on the morning breeze, discussions of weather patterns and trail conditions spoken in the practical tones of men with serious work to accomplish. Mayor Harrison Blackwood emerged from his office, like a spider sensing vibrations in his web, his black suit immaculate despite the early hour and his silver watch chain glinting with self-importance. He approached the expedition with the measured stride of a man conscious of his position and determined to assert it from the first moment of contact. Behind him trailed his nephew Samuel, a pale young man with nervous eyes and soft hands who served as his uncle's clerk and general factotum. "Gentlemen, welcome to Bitter Creek." Harrison's voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any gathering. "I'm Mayor Blackwood, and I trust your journey was without incident." The expedition leader, a weathered man with government credentials and the tired eyes of a bureaucrat who had seen too many frontier towns, stepped forward to handle the formal introductions. But Kate noticed that Harrison's attention kept drifting to Joseph, his gaze carrying the particular quality of suspicion that some white men reserve for Indians who move too confidently through their world. "Mr. Crow Feather, I believe," Harrison said when the introductions reached Joseph. "I've heard of your work with the territorial surveys. Quite a reputation for finding your way through difficult country." Joseph's response was courteous but contained, neither deferent nor challenging. "I try to earn my pay honestly, Mayor Blackwood. The territory has many faces, and most of them reward patience more than haste." There was something in the way he spoke that suggested depths beneath the surface, intelligence that had learned to present itself carefully in situations where it might be seen as threatening. Kate found herself drawn to the measured quality of his voice, the way he seemed to consider each word before releasing it into the world. The formal business of arranging lodging and supplies proceeded with the usual negotiations between government efficiency and frontier practicality. The expedition would remain in Bitter Creek for 3 days while Joseph scouted the routes ahead and the surveyors checked their instruments against known landmarks. They would need meals, fodder for their animals, and repairs to equipment that had suffered from hard travel. Kate was still watching from her window when Joseph separated himself from the group and began walking along the storefronts, his eyes taking in the details of Bitter Creek's commercial district with the assessment of someone who understood that a town's character could be read in its buildings and businesses. She found herself holding her breath as he approached her shop, uncertain whether she hoped he would enter or pass by. The bell above her door chimed with unusual clarity as Joseph stepped inside, bringing with him the sense of leather, sage, and the open country. He removed his hat as he crossed the threshold, a gesture of courtesy that seemed automatic rather than calculated, and his dark eyes swept across the modest interior of her shop with respectful attention. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, and she was surprised by the warmth in his voice. "My cousin Mary mentioned she had spoken with you." Kate's mouth felt suddenly dry, but she managed to find her voice. "Mr. Crowfeather, yes, she was here yesterday. She spoke of possibilities." Joseph moved further into the shop, his presence seeming to fill the small space without overwhelming it. He paused beside her work table, where several pieces awaited completion, and studied them with the focused attention of someone who understood the value of skilled craftsmanship. "Beautiful work," he said, touching the edge of a partially completed quilt with careful fingers. "Mary was right about your skill with needle and thread. Thank you. Your cousin mentioned that your people might have need of such services." Joseph turned to face her directly, and Kate felt the full impact of his attention, like standing too close to a well-tended fire. There was something in his expression that seemed to see past the surface of things, to look at her not as the town's struggling seamstress, but as someone whose worth existed independent of Bitter Creek's opinions. "We do have such needs," he said. "But I think you understand that Mary's visit was about more than business arrangements." Kate's heart began beating faster, though she wasn't entirely sure why. "I'm not certain I understand your meaning, Mr. Crowfeather." Joseph smiled, and the expression transformed his face from merely handsome to something approaching beautiful. "Small towns can be prisons for people who don't fit the shapes others have chosen for them. Sometimes a person needs to see that there are other places, other ways of living." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge Kate wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. "And you think I'm such a person?" "I think you're a woman with skills and intelligence who has been told she should be grateful for circumstances that would drive a lesser person to despair. I think you deserve better than what this town has decided to offer you." Kate felt something loosening in her chest, a tightness she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there. "Mr. Crowfeather, I appreciate your concern, but you don't know my situation. I have obligations here, debts that must be paid." "Debts to whom?" Joseph's tone remained gentle, but there was steel beneath the surface. "To people who have decided your value based on your husband's failures? To a community that measures your worth by their own small standards?" Before Kate could answer, the shop door opened again with sharp urgency, and Sheriff Tom Bradley entered with the harassed expression of a man dealing with complications he hadn't anticipated. His eyes moved quickly between Kate and Joseph, reading the situation with the practiced assessment of someone trained to notice when tension might be building toward trouble. "Mr. Crowfeather," Tom said with careful politeness, "I hope you're finding everything you need in Bitter Creek." Sheriff Bradley: "Yes, everyone has been quite accommodating." Tom's expression suggested he had his doubts about that assessment. "I wonder if I might have a word with you about the survey routes you'll be taking. Some concerns about recent weather conditions." Joseph nodded, understanding that the sheriff was diplomatically suggesting he conclude his business with Kate. "Of course, Sheriff. Mrs. Sullivan, perhaps we could continue our conversation later." "I'd like that," Kate heard herself saying, surprised by her own boldness. After both men left, Kate stood alone in her shop, feeling as though the familiar space had been transformed by Joseph's presence. The afternoon light seemed different somehow, charged with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. For the first time in 3 years, she found herself wondering not just how she would survive tomorrow, but what kind of life she might choose if survival wasn't her only concern. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks that felt anything but routine. Kate found her attention drifting constantly to the window, watching for glimpses of Joseph as he moved about the town with the survey expedition. She observed the way he interacted with the other team members, noting how they clearly respected his knowledge and judgment, despite any prejudices they might harbor about his heritage. She watched him examine the local buildings and businesses, with the eye of someone who understood how communities functioned, who could read the stories written in architecture and commerce. Most tellingly, she watched how the townspeople reacted to him. The men treated him with careful courtesy, recognizing his official capacity while maintaining the subtle distance that marked him as different. The women's reactions varied more widely, from Dorothy Hendrick's visible disapproval to the curious glances of younger ladies who seemed intrigued by his exotic appearance. But it was the children who responded most naturally, following him with the uncomplicated fascination that drew them to anything new and interesting in their limited world. As evening approached, Kate realized she had been anticipating Joseph's return to her shop with an intensity that surprised her. She had lived for 3 years in the gray landscape of diminished expectations, accepting that her life would be defined by struggle and gradual decline. The possibility that someone might see her differently, might offer her choices beyond mere survival, felt almost too dangerous to contemplate. The sun was setting behind the western mountains when Joseph finally returned, the last light of day casting long shadows across the dusty street. This time he entered her shop with less formality, as though their earlier conversation had established a foundation for easier interaction. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, and she noticed that he had dropped the careful courtesy of their first meeting. "I've been thinking about our conversation, as have I, Mr. Crowfeather." "Joseph," he corrected gently. "If we're to be friends, perhaps we should use the names our mothers gave us." Kate felt heat rising in her cheeks at the casual intimacy of the suggestion. "Kate," she said softly. Joseph smiled at her response, then grew more serious. "Kate, I want to be direct with you about something. I've been asking questions around town today, and I've learned about your debt situation with Mayor Blackwood." Kate's stomach clenched with embarrassment. "I see. $300 is a significant sum, but it's not insurmountable for someone with your skills if they had access to the right markets. The work Mary described, along with other opportunities I know of, could provide income that would make such a debt manageable." "Other opportunities?" Joseph moved closer, and Kate caught again the scent of sage and leather that seemed to surround him. "There are settlements to the north where skilled seamstresses are desperately needed. Trading posts where someone who could work with both European and native styles would be invaluable. Communities where your worth would be measured by what you could contribute, not by what your husband owed." The vision he painted seemed almost too good to be true, like fairy tales told to children who had never learned that such stories were meant to be impossible. "And you think I could succeed in such places? I think you could flourish in such places. But Kate, you need to understand something else. Leaving Bitter Creek wouldn't just mean changing your location. It would mean choosing a different kind of life, one where you might be accepted by people your current neighbors would consider unacceptable." Kate understood the implications of his words. Associating with Joseph and his people would mark her as someone who had crossed lines that proper society preferred to keep clearly drawn. In towns like Bitter Creek, such associations could permanently alter how a person was perceived and treated. "Are you asking me to choose between respectability and happiness?" Joseph's laugh was low and rich, like water running over smooth stones. "Kate, look around you. What respectability are you protecting? What happiness are you preserving?" The truth of his words hit her like cold water. She had been clinging to the appearance of respectability while living in circumstances that grew more desperate by the month. She had been protecting a reputation that had already been damaged beyond repair by forces beyond her control. "What exactly are you proposing, Joseph? Come with us when we leave Bitter Creek. See what lies beyond the borders of this town. If you don't like what you find, you can always return. But at least you'll know what choices are available to you." The proposal took Kate's breath away with its audacity and simplicity. "I can't just abandon everything I've built here." "What have you built here, Kate, honestly?" The question forced her to examine her life with uncomfortable clarity. What had she built? A failing business that barely kept her fed. A social position that existed only through the grudging tolerance of people who made no secret of their disapproval. A future that promised nothing but gradual decline into poverty and irrelevance. "My shop," she said weakly, "could be sold to pay part of your debt to Blackwood. Your skills could be practiced anywhere. Your life could be lived anywhere, with people who value what you have to offer." Kate walked to her window and looked out at the street where she had struggled for 3 years to maintain her dignity and independence. The familiar view seemed different now, less like home and more like a limitation she had accepted without question. "When do you leave?" "Day after tomorrow, early morning." "That's not much time to make such a decision." Joseph joined her at the window, his presence warm and solid beside her. "Sometimes the most important decisions can't be made through careful deliberation, Kate. Sometimes they have to be made with the heart." Kate turned to look at him, studying the face that had become so important to her in the span of a single day. There was kindness there, but also strength. Intelligence tempered by experience. And something else, something that looked remarkably like hope. "If I were to consider such a thing," she said carefully, "what would people say?" "People will say what they choose to say regardless of what you do. The question is whether you're going to let their words determine the shape of your life." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of voices drifted through the evening air from the direction of the Broken Wheel Saloon. Kate could hear the familiar cadences of men who had been drinking and talking, their voices carrying the particular tone of people discussing something they considered scandalous. "Crow Feather's been sniffing around the Sullivan woman all day," someone was saying, the words clearly audible through the thin walls that separated Kate's shop from the street. "What do you expect?" came another voice. "She's desperate enough to take interest from anyone willing to give it. Disgusting is what it is." White woman lowering herself to consort with half-breeds. Kate felt her face burning with shame and anger, but Joseph's expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. "Now you know what they really think of you." He sighed quietly. "Does their good opinion still seem worth preserving?" Kate closed her eyes, feeling something fundamental shifting inside her like bedrock settling into a new configuration. When she opened them again, Joseph was still there, still looking at her with the same patient kindness that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "If I were to come with you," she said slowly, "what would be expected of me?" "Nothing more than being yourself. Nothing less than being true to who you really are." Kate nodded, the gesture feeling like the first honest thing she had done in years. "Then I think we have more to discuss." Part 3. The decision the next morning brought with it a clarity that Kate had not experienced since before Thomas's death. She woke before dawn with her mind sharp and focused, as though the fog of uncertainty that had clouded her thoughts for months had finally lifted. Outside her window, Bitter Creek was beginning its daily routine, unaware that one of its residents was contemplating a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. Kate moved through her morning preparations with unusual deliberation, each action weighted with the knowledge that it might be among the last she performed in this familiar space. She made coffee with her remaining good beans, allowing herself this small luxury as she considered the magnitude of what Joseph had proposed. The coffee was strong and bitter, like the medicine that was sometimes necessary to cure what ailed a person. As she sipped from her chipped porcelain cup, Kate found herself cataloging the contents of her shop and living quarters with new eyes. The bolts of fabric she had hoarded against future need, the sewing implements that had belonged to her mother, the few personal belongings that connected her to a past that had died with Thomas. How much of this represented genuine attachment? and how much was simply the accumulated weight of a life lived without direction. The morning light revealed dust motes dancing in the air, and Kate realized that everything in her world had taken on a temporary quality, as though she were already viewing it from a distance. The sensation was both terrifying and liberating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering that the fear of falling was less powerful than the desire to fly. Her contemplation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, delivered with the authority of someone unaccustomed to waiting. For admittance. Kate opened it to find Mayor Harrison Blackwood standing on her threshold, dressed in his customary black suit and carrying an air of official business that made her stomach clench with anticipation of trouble. "Mrs. Sullivan," Harrison said, removing his hat with perfunctory courtesy. "I trust I'm not calling too early." "Not at all, Mayor Blackwood. Please come in." Harrison entered her shop with the careful assessment of a man evaluating property he expected to own soon. His eyes moved across her modest inventory and simple furnishings with the calculating gaze of someone determining value and salvage potential. Kate watched him conduct this informal appraisal and felt her resolve hardening like steel tempered in fire. "I've come to discuss a matter of some urgency," Harrison began, settling himself in the chair beside her work table as though he belonged there. "It has come to my attention that you've been entertaining unconventional visitors recently." Kate kept her expression neutral, though her heart began beating faster. "I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning." "The half-breed scout, Mrs. Sullivan, Joseph Crowfeather. I'm told he's been spending considerable time in your establishment." The contempt in Harrison's voice when he spoke Joseph's name made Kate's jaw tighten, but she forced herself to respond calmly. "Mr. Crowfeather inquired about sewing services for his people. It's a business matter." Harrison's smile was thin and cold, like ice forming on still water. "I'm sure that's how it began. But Mrs. Sullivan, surely you understand how such associations appear to the decent people of this community. A white woman of your circumstances consorting with Indians. It reflects poorly on all of us." "My circumstances, Mayor Blackwood?" "Come now, we needn't pretend. You're a woman alone, struggling financially, perhaps vulnerable to attention from inappropriate sources. It's understandable, but it's also dangerous." Kate felt something rising in her throat, hot and bitter as the coffee she had been drinking. Dangerous to whom? To yourself, primarily, but also to the moral fabric of our community. "We have standards to maintain, Mrs. Sullivan. Standards that protect everyone, including you." Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression taking on the paternal quality of a man explaining simple facts to a child. "Which brings me to the real purpose of my visit. I've been reconsidering your debt situation, and I believe we might be able to reach a more manageable arrangement." Kate's pulse quickened despite her efforts to remain calm. "What kind of arrangement?" "Well, $300 is indeed a substantial sum, far beyond your current ability to pay. But if you were willing to be reasonable about certain matters, we might be able to reduce it significantly." "Reasonable in what way?" Harrison's smile widened, revealing teeth that reminded Kate of a predator's warning display. "Simply this. You deed your property to me as collateral against the debt, and I'll reduce the amount owed to $100, payable over 2 years at reasonable interest. You could continue operating your business under my protection with the security of knowing that your future is assured." The offer was wrapped in the language of generosity, but Kate understood exactly what Harrison was proposing. He wanted her property and her independence in exchange for becoming his tenant and debtor. She would trade outright ownership for the illusion of security, binding herself to him in a way that would make her permanently dependent on his goodwill. "And if I were to refuse this generous offer?" Harrison's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Then I would be forced to pursue collection through the usual legal channels. Sheriff Bradley is a good man, but he understands his duty when it comes to enforcing legitimate debts. I would hate to see you lose everything through stubborn pride." The threat was delivered with the smooth efficiency of a man who had perfected the art of intimidation through years of practice. Kate recognized that Harrison had not come to negotiate. He had come to dictate terms that would benefit him regardless of how she responded. Refuse his offer, and he would take everything. Accept it, and he would own everything. "I see, and this arrangement would require me to, what? Avoid certain associations?" "I think we understand each other perfectly, Mrs. Sullivan. A woman, under my protection, would naturally conduct herself in a manner befitting her position in the community." Kate stood up from her chair, needing to move, to break the suffocating tension that Harrison's presence had brought into her small space. She walked to the window and looked out at the street, seeing it with the eyes of someone who had just been offered a choice between different forms of captivity. "Mayor Blackwood, may I ask you something?" "Of course." Kate turned to face him, her hands steady at her sides despite the tumultuous emotions churning in her chest. "Do you truly believe that I don't understand what you're offering me?" Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, as though surprised by the directness of her question. "I'm offering you security, Mrs. Sullivan, a future without the constant worry of debt and destitution. You're offering me a cage with prettier bars than the one I'm currently occupying. You want me to trade my independence for your version of protection, which would make me accountable to your version of morality." Harrison's face darkened with displeasure at having his offer described so bluntly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I think you may be allowing emotion to cloud your judgment. Perhaps you should take some time to consider the practical realities of your situation." "Oh, I've been considering the practical realities quite thoroughly, Mayor Blackwood. And I've reached some interesting conclusions." Kate moved away from the window, putting the work table between herself and Harrison like a barrier against the weight of his expectations. "You see, I've realized something important over the past few days. I've been so concerned with maintaining respectability in this town that I forgot to ask myself whether this town's version of respectability was worth maintaining." Harrison stood up abruptly, his composure beginning to crack around the edges. "Mrs. Sullivan, I strongly advise you not to make any hasty decisions based on the influence of unsuitable companions." "Unsuitable according to whom?" "You? The same people who have spent 3 years treating me like a burden they're forced to tolerate. The same people who have provided you with customers and community, despite your challenging circumstances." Kate laughed, a sound that surprised her with its genuine amusement. "Customers who complain about my work and reduce my payments? Community that whispers about me behind my back and offers charity disguised as concern. Mayor Blackwood, if that's the best this town has to offer, perhaps it's time I looked elsewhere." Harrison's mask of benevolent authority finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Mrs. Sullivan, I fear you don't fully understand your position. Without my protection, you have no position in this community at all. Then perhaps I don't need a position in this community." The words hung in the air between them like a declaration of war. Harrison stared at Kate as though she had suddenly begun speaking a foreign language, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. "You're making a serious mistake," he said finally. "Maybe, but it will be my mistake to make." Harrison replaced his hat with sharp, angry movements. "I'll give you until tomorrow morning to reconsider. After that, the offer is withdrawn and I pursue collection through legal means." "I understand." "I hope you do, Mrs. Sullivan. I truly hope you do." After Harrison left, Kate stood alone in her shop, feeling as though she had just survived a battle she hadn't known she was fighting. The confrontation had crystallized something that had been forming in her mind since Joseph's first visit, the recognition that she had been trying to preserve something that had already been lost, defending a position that had never truly been hers to occupy. The rest of the morning passed quietly, with Kate moving through familiar tasks while her mind worked through the implications of her conversation with Harrison. She understood now that remaining in Bitter Creek meant accepting whatever terms he chose to impose, becoming a cautionary tale about the consequences of failing to know one's place. Leaving meant abandoning the security of the familiar, but it also meant escaping the limitations that security imposed. Shortly after noon, Joseph returned to her shop, entering with the easy confidence of someone who belonged wherever he chose to stand. Kate found herself studying his face, searching for signs of the conversation she knew he must have had with other townspeople about his continued presence in Bitter Creek. "You look like a woman who has been thinking seriously about serious matters," he said, settling into the chair Harrison had vacated hours earlier. "I had a visit from Mayor Blackwood this morning." Joseph's expression darkened slightly. "I see. And what did the good mayor have to say?" Kate related the conversation in detail, watching Joseph's face as she described Harrison's offer and ultimatum. When she finished, Joseph sat quietly for several moments, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the shop's small window. "What did you tell him?" he asked finally. "I told him I would make my own decisions about my own life." Joseph smiled, and Kate felt warmth spreading through her chest like sunrise after a long night. "And have you made your decision?" Kate walked to the trunk where she kept her most precious possessions, items she had been unwilling to sell even during her most desperate moments. She opened it and withdrew a small leather pouch containing the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her mother, along with the letters Thomas had written during their brief courtship. These were the things that connected her to a past worth remembering, the only possessions that would truly matter wherever she chose to go. "I have," she said, turning to face Joseph with the pouch clutched in her hands. "I want to see what lies beyond Bitter Creek. I want to discover what kind of life might be possible for someone like me in a place where being someone like me isn't considered a problem to be solved." Joseph stood up and moved toward her, his expression serious but warm. "Kate, you need to understand what you're choosing. Leaving here means more than just going somewhere else. It means becoming someone else, someone who doesn't need the approval of people like Harrison Blackwood to know her own worth." "I understand. And Joseph, I need you to understand something as well. I'm not asking you to rescue me from my circumstances. I'm asking you to show me how to rescue myself." Joseph reached out and took her hands in his, the leather pouch pressed between their palms like a promise. "That's exactly what I was hoping you would say." Kate felt something settling into place inside her chest, like a puzzle piece finding its proper position after years of being forced into spaces where it didn't belong. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt as though she was moving towards something rather than simply away from disaster. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow at dawn. Can you be ready?" Kate looked around her shop one final time, seeing it now as a chapter in her life that was ending rather than a prison that had trapped her. "I'll be ready." That evening, Kate worked by candlelight to sort through her possessions, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. She packed her sewing supplies, her mother's jewelry, and a few changes of clothing. Everything else would remain for Harrison to claim when he discovered her gone, partial payment toward a debt she no longer acknowledged as valid. As she worked, Kate found herself thinking about the woman she had been when she first arrived in Bitter Creek as Thomas's bride, full of hopes and dreams that had seemed achievable then. That woman had been gradually worn away by circumstances and disappointment until only a diminished version remained, someone who had learned to expect less and accept whatever was offered. Tomorrow she would begin the process of discovering who she might become when freed from those expectations and limitations. The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of unknown territory with only courage and curiosity as guides. Kate Sullivan went to bed that night for the last time in the room where she had learned to survive alone. When she woke, she would begin learning how to live. Part 4. The escape dawn arrived with a pale gray light that seemed to seep through the windows like spilled water, illuminating Kate's small room with the neutral glow of beginnings. She had slept fitfully, her mind too active with plans and possibilities to surrender completely to rest, but she woke feeling more alert and focused than she had in months. Today marked the end of her life in Bitter Creek and the beginning of something she couldn't yet name but felt in her bones like approaching weather. Kate dressed carefully in her most practical clothing, choosing garments that would serve her well during travel, rather than maintaining appearances for neighbors who had never truly accepted her anyway. Her hands were steady as she braided her hair and secured it with pins, though she could feel the rapid beating of her heart against her ribs like a bird testing the strength of its cage. The bundle she had prepared the night before sat beside her door, containing everything she valued enough to carry into an uncertain future. It seemed impossibly small to represent 3 years of life in Bitter Creek, but Kate understood now that most of what she was leaving behind had never truly belonged to her anyway. The shop, the furniture, the accumulated possessions of a life lived in gradual decline. These were simply the stage dressing for a play she no longer wanted to perform. Kate opened her door and stepped into the cool morning air, breathing deeply of the scent of sage and dust that characterized the High Plains country. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of horses moving restlessly, the soft jingle of harness and equipment that meant the survey expedition was preparing to depart. Her pulse quickened with the knowledge that she was about to join them, to transform herself from observer to participant in whatever adventures lay ahead. The streets of Bitter Creek were largely empty at this early hour, with only a few early risers moving about their morning routines. Kate walked through the town she had called home for 3 years, seeing it now with the eyes of someone who was already gone. The buildings that had seemed permanent and unchanging now appeared fragile and temporary, like stage sets that could be struck and moved at will. The people who had loomed so large in her daily existence seemed smaller somehow, reduced to their proper proportions by her decision to seek a larger world. Kate reached the appointed meeting place behind the livery stable to find Joseph waiting with 2 horses, one of which was clearly intended for her use. The mare was a sturdy chestnut with intelligent eyes and a gentle disposition, saddled and ready for travel. Beside her stood Joseph's own mount, a tall gelding with the lean build and alert bearing of a horse accustomed to long journeys through challenging terrain. "Good morning," Joseph said, his voice soft and the pre-dawn quiet. "Are you ready for this?" Kate looked back toward the center of town, where smoke was beginning to rise from chimneys as people started their daily routines. In a few hours, they would discover her absence and begin speculating about her disappearance. Harrison Blackwood would arrive at her shop to demand an answer to his ultimatum and find only empty rooms and a note explaining that she had chosen to seek her fortune elsewhere. "I'm ready," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Joseph helped her secure her bundle to the mare's saddle, his hands gentle but efficient as he checked the straps and stirrups. Kate found herself studying his profile in the growing light, noting the concentration in his expression and the economical grace of his movements. There was something deeply reassuring about his competence, the way he seemed to anticipate potential problems and address them before they could develop. "The survey team left an hour ago," Joseph explained as he checked his own gear. "We'll catch up with them by midday, but this gives us time to travel more quietly until we're well clear of Bitter Creek." Kate nodded, understanding the wisdom of avoiding attention during their departure. The last thing either of them needed was a confrontation with townspeople who might feel entitled to express their opinions about her choices. Better to slip away like morning mist, leaving only questions and speculation in their wake. Joseph mounted his horse with fluid ease, then waited patiently while Kate settled herself in the saddle. It had been several years since she had ridden regularly, but the familiar sensation of a horse moving beneath her brought back memories of happier times, when she had been young enough to believe that adventures were things that happened to people like her. They rode away from Bitter Creek as the sun climbed above the eastern horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber that made the familiar country seem transformed. Kate resisted the urge to look back, focusing instead on the path ahead in the steady rhythm of her mare's gait. With each mile that passed, she felt the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders like morning fog burning away in sunlight. The country they traversed was magnificent in its austere beauty, rolling plains dotted with sage and prairie grass, stretching toward distant mountains that seemed to float above the horizon like purple dreams. Kate had seen this landscape countless times from her shop window, but experiencing it from horseback gave her a new appreciation for its scale and grandeur. Here was space enough for a person to reinvent herself, to become whoever she chose to be without the constraints of other people's expectations. Joseph proved to be an excellent traveling companion, sharing his knowledge of the country and its history without overwhelming her with information. He pointed out landmarks and natural features, explaining how the land had been shaped by ancient forces and how it continued to change with each season. Joseph's knowledge of the terrain revealed itself in countless small ways as they traveled deeper into the vast expanse of Wyoming territory. He guided them along paths that seemed invisible to Kate's untrained eye, following ridgelines and creek beds that provided easier passage while keeping them hidden from casual observation. The wisdom embedded in his route selection became apparent. As the morning progressed and they encountered no other travelers, no curious ranchers or territorial officials who might question their journey or remember their passage, the conversation between them flowed as naturally as the streams they crossed, moving from practical matters of travel to deeper discussions about life, dreams, and the courage required to pursue both. Kate found herself sharing stories she had never told another living soul, memories of childhood ambitions and adult disappointments that had shaped her understanding of what was possible for someone in her circumstances. Joseph listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that every person's story contained wisdom worth preserving. "My grandmother used to say that the earth remembers every footstep," Joseph said as they paused to rest the horses beside a clear spring that bubbled up from underground sources. She believed that when we walk with respect and purpose, we add something good to the memory of the land. Kate dismounted and knelt beside the spring, cupping the cold water in her hands and drinking deeply. The taste was clean and mineral-rich, nothing like the brackish well water that served Bitter Creek's needs. "And what do you think she would say about our journey?" Joseph smiled, his expression softened by affection from memories of the woman who had helped shape his understanding of the world. "I think she would say that sometimes the most respectful thing a person can do is refuse to accept limitations that others try to impose. She would say that walking away from a life that makes you smaller is a form of prayer." The words resonated in Kate's chest like the vibration of a struck bell. She had never thought of her escape from Bitter Creek in spiritual terms, but she recognized the truth in Joseph's grandmother's wisdom. There had been something sacred about the moment she decided to leave, something that felt like honoring a part of herself she had almost forgotten existed. They resumed their journey with renewed energy, the horses refreshed by water and rest, their riders bonded by shared confidences and common purpose. The landscape continued to reveal its hidden beauties as they traveled, from wildflower meadows tucked into protected valleys to dramatic rock formations that spoke of geological forces beyond human comprehension. Kate began to understand why Joseph had chosen to make his living in this country, why he seemed so perfectly suited to movement through terrain that would challenge less experienced travelers. The sun reached its zenith as they crested a ridge that provided their first view of the survey expedition's camp in the valley below. Kate could see the organized efficiency of experienced travelers, tents arranged in a defensive circle with the supply wagons positioned to provide additional protection. Smoke rose from carefully tended fires, and the sound of men's voices carried on the afternoon breeze, discussing the technical aspects of their work with the casual competence of professionals who trusted each other's expertise. "They're good men," Joseph said, following her gaze. "They've learned to judge people by their actions rather than their circumstances." Kate felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach at the prospect of joining a group of strangers who would form their own opinions about her presence among them. "What have you told them about me?" "Only that you're a skilled seamstress seeking new opportunities in the northern settlements. The rest is your story to tell or keep private as you choose." The consideration implicit in his answer touched Kate deeply. Joseph had created space for her to define herself rather than allowing others to define her, a gift more precious than gold in her experience. She straightened in her saddle, preparing to meet these men as the person she was choosing to become rather than the person Bitter Creek had decided she should remain. Their arrival in camp was met with the polite interest of men who had learned to welcome competent additions to their group while maintaining healthy skepticism about unknown quantities. The expedition leader, a weathered surveyor named Captain Morrison, greeted Kate with old-fashioned courtesy that seemed genuine rather than performed. The other team members followed his lead, offering introductions and assistance with her gear without the elaborate gallantry that often masked discomfort with women in unconventional circumstances. Kate found herself assigned to share a tent with the expedition's cook and quartermaster, a practical Scotsman named Duncan Macready, who had spent more years on the frontier than most people lived altogether. Duncan's acceptance of her presence seemed to be based entirely on her potential usefulness to the group's welfare, and he wasted no time in putting her sewing skills to work repairing equipment damaged during their journey from the territorial capital. "Canvas tears easier than it should," Duncan explained, showing her a collection of torn tent panels and ripped supply sacks. "Good needlework can mean the difference between dry sleep and miserable nights when the weather turns bad." Kate examined the damaged materials with the critical eye of someone who understood that quality repairs required proper technique and attention to detail. "I can fix these, but it will take time to do the work properly." "Time we have plenty of, lass. Quality is what keeps us alive out here." The afternoon passed quickly as Kate immersed herself in familiar work, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, while her mind processed the dramatic changes in her circumstances. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had been trapped in a life that offered only declining prospects and increasing desperation. Now she found herself part of a group whose mission took them into territory that existed more in maps and speculation than settled reality. The other men treated her with the respectful reserve appropriate to someone whose capabilities were not yet fully proven, but she sensed no hostility or disapproval in their attitudes. These were practical men who valued competence above social convention, and they seemed willing to judge her by her contributions rather than her past or the circumstances that had brought her to their camp. As evening approached, Kate helped Duncan prepare the communal meal, working with ingredients and techniques that differed significantly from the limited options available in Bitter Creek. The frontier diet emphasized nutrition and preservation over refinement, but Duncan's years of experience had taught him to create satisfying meals from simple components. Kate found herself learning as much as helping, absorbing knowledge that would serve her well in whatever future awaited, beyond the known boundaries of civilization. The men gathered around the fire after supper, their conversation ranging from technical discussions of surveying techniques to stories of their experiences in other territories. Kate listened with fascination to accounts of landscapes and communities she had never imagined, places where different rules applied and different possibilities existed for people willing to work for them. "The northern settlements are hungry for skilled tradespeople," one of the surveyors explained when the conversation turned to opportunities in the regions they were mapping. "Too many people trying to make fortunes from mining or ranching, not enough focused on the services that make communities sustainable." "What kind of services?" Kate asked. drawn into the discussion despite her usual preference for listening rather than participating in groups of strangers. Everything that makes life bearable when you're far from established supply lines. Good cooking, skilled mending, reliable medical care, competent teaching. The basics that people take for granted until they're not available. Kate felt excitement stirring in her chest as she considered the possibilities implied by such needs. Her skills with needle and thread could be valuable in communities that lacked access to manufactured goods and professional seamstresses. More importantly, such communities might offer the chance to build a reputation based on her abilities rather than her history. Joseph joined the conversation with observations drawn from his extensive travels throughout the territory. The key is finding places where people are too busy building their futures to spend much time judging each other's pasts, he said, his eyes meeting Kate's across the firelight. Places where what matters is what you can contribute, not who your family was or what mistakes you might have made. The words carried obvious relevance to Kate's situation, but they were delivered with enough general application that the other men could appreciate their wisdom without feeling excluded from a private communication. Kate recognized the skill with which Joseph had affirmed her worth while avoiding any appearance of special pleading that might have made her seem like a charity case rather than a legitimate member of their group. The fire burned lower as the evening progressed, and the men began drifting toward their tents with the easy routine of people accustomed to early rising and hard work. Kate helped Duncan secure the cooking equipment and food supplies, learning the protocols that kept their camp organized and efficient. When the work was finished, she found herself standing alone beside the dying fire, looking up at stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than any she had seen from Bitter Creek. Joseph appeared beside her with the quiet movement of someone who had learned to travel silently through all kinds of terrain. "How are you feeling about your decision?" Kate considered the question seriously, examining her emotional state with the same attention she would give to a complex piece of needlework. "Terrified and exhilarated in equal measure," she said finally. "Like I've jumped off a cliff and discovered I might actually be able to fly. That's a good sign." Fear and excitement often feel the same when you're doing something that matters. Kate turned to face him, studying his features in the dim light cast by the glowing embers. "Joseph, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Of course. Why did you decide to help me? You barely knew me when you offered to change my life completely." "That's not a decision most people would make lightly." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains that rose like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully considered truth. "When I was younger, I watched my mother struggle to find her place in a world that couldn't decide whether to accept or reject her. She was Lakota by birth but married to a French trapper, which made her suspect to both communities. She spent years trying to prove she belonged somewhere, anywhere, and it nearly destroyed her spirit." Kate waited for him to continue, sensing that this story held the key to understanding not just his motivation, but something essential about the man himself. Eventually, she stopped trying to fit into spaces that were too small for her. She created her own space, her own community, her own way of living that honored both sides of her heritage without apologizing for either. She became stronger and happier than I had ever seen her. "And you saw something similar in my situation?" "I saw a woman with talents and intelligence being crushed by people too small to appreciate what they were destroying. I saw someone who deserved the chance my mother had to discover what she could become when freed from other people's limitations." Kate felt tears forming in her eyes, moved by the recognition that her struggles had been witnessed and understood by someone who saw them clearly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank me when you've built the life you're meant to live," Joseph replied. "That's when you'll know whether my interference was helpful or merely presumptuous." Kate laughed softly, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "I think I already know the answer to that question. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other at exactly the moment when finding each other mattered most. Around them, the camp settled into the quiet rhythms of sleep, while above them the stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow comforting in their constancy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight Kate Sullivan felt something she had almost forgotten was possible: hope for a future that held more than mere survival. She was no longer the desperate seamstress clinging to respectability in a town that had never truly accepted her. She was a woman with skills and courage, traveling toward possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. Part 4: The Pursuit. 3 days into their journey northward, the expedition had settled into the comfortable rhythm of experienced travelers moving through familiar territory. Kate had found her place within the group's daily routines, contributing her skills to maintain equipment while learning the practical knowledge that would serve her in frontier communities. The work was satisfying in ways that her previous life had never been. Each task completed adding genuine value to their collective welfare, rather than simply marking time until the next crisis. Kate's mare had proven to be an excellent choice. For long-distance travel, possessing both the stamina for extended days in the saddle and the intelligence to navigate challenging terrain without constant guidance. The relationship between horse and rider was developing into the kind of partnership that made difficult journeys possible, built on mutual trust and understanding rather than mere mechanical cooperation. The country they traversed grew more dramatic with each passing day, the rolling plains giving way to broken hills carved by ancient watercourses and crowned with wind-sculpted rock formations. Captain Morrison explained that they were entering the region where his maps became more theoretical than practical, territory that had been explored but not thoroughly surveyed. Every mile they covered added to the official knowledge of Wyoming, territory's northern reaches, while bringing them closer to the communities that might offer Kate the fresh start she sought. Joseph continued to serve as their guide through this increasingly unfamiliar landscape, his knowledge of the terrain complemented by an intuitive understanding of weather patterns and seasonal changes that could affect their progress. Kate watched him work with growing admiration for the depth of his expertise, recognizing that his skills represented a lifetime of careful observation and hard-earned experience. The morning of their 4th day brought the first sign that their journey might not proceed as smoothly as they had hoped. Joseph returned from his dawn reconnaissance with an expression of concern that immediately caught Captain Morrison's attention and brought conversation around the breakfast fire to an abrupt halt. "We have company following us," Joseph reported. Without preamble. 3 riders, maybe 4, staying about 2 miles back but matching our pace too closely to be coincidental. Captain Morrison's weathered face hardened with the look of a man accustomed to dealing with complications that threatened his mission. "How long have they been back there?" "I first noticed them yesterday afternoon, but they could have been following us longer without being obvious about it. They're skilled at using the terrain to stay hidden." Kate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, understanding immediately who their pursuers were likely to be and what their presence meant for her hopes of escaping Bitter Creek's limitations. She had known that Harrison Blackwood would not simply accept her disappearance, but she had hoped that his pride would prevent him from taking dramatic action to retrieve someone he had publicly dismissed as worthless. "Any idea who they might be or what they want?" Morrison asked, though his glance toward Kate suggested he had already formed his own conclusions about the situation. Joseph's eyes met Kate's across the dying fire, and she saw sympathy mixed with determination in his expression. "I suspect they're from Bitter Creek, looking to retrieve someone they believe belongs to them." Morrison nodded grimly, understanding the implications for his expedition's safety and mission. Territorial disputes over property, including human property in the form of wives, children, or indentured servants, could quickly escalate into violence that would endanger everyone in his care. "Mrs. Sullivan," Morrison said, addressing Kate directly with the respectful formality he showed to all members of his team. "Is there anything you need to tell us about your circumstances in Bitter Creek?" Kate straightened her shoulders, meeting Morrison's steady gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. "Mayor Blackwood claimed that my late husband owed him a substantial debt, which he threatened to collect by seizing my property and person if necessary. I chose to leave rather than submit to his terms. And you believe he would pursue you? To prevent that choice? I believe Harrison Blackwood is a man who doesn't accept being told no by people he considers beneath his authority." Morrison exchanged glances with his senior surveyor, a silent communication that spoke of shared experience with similar situations in other frontier communities. Men like Blackwood existed throughout the territories, using their economic power and political connections to dominate others while hiding behind legal technicalities and social conventions. "What are our options?" Morrison asked Joseph. "We can try to outrun them, but that means pushing hard through country that gets more difficult ahead. We can confront them directly and try to resolve this through negotiation. Or we can use the terrain to our advantage and make it clear that pursuing us further would be more costly than they're prepared to pay." Kate felt the weight of responsibility for putting these good men in danger settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Captain Morrison, I won't ask you to risk your mission or your men for my sake. If it would be better for everyone, I can return with them and face whatever consequences await me." Morrison's expression softened slightly, though his voice remained firm with command authority. "Mrs. Sullivan, you're under the protection of this expedition now. We don't abandon our people to bullies and tyrants, regardless of what legal papers they might wave around." The simple declaration of loyalty touched Kate more deeply than elaborate promises might have done. These men, who had known her for only a few days, were prepared to defend her right to choose her own path against people who had controlled her life for years. "What do you recommend, Joseph?" Morrison asked. Joseph stood and moved to his saddle bags, retrieving a brass telescope that allowed him to study distant objects with greater clarity. "Give me an hour to scout their position and numbers more precisely. Then we'll know better what kind of problem we're dealing with." Kate spent the next hour helping Duncan pack their camp equipment while trying to control the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The possibility that she might be forced to return to Bitter Creek felt like contemplating her own death, a surrender of everything she had discovered about herself during these few days of freedom. When Joseph returned, his expression was grim but determined. 4 riders, armed and equipped for extended pursuit. I recognized 2 of them through the scope, Samuel Blackwood and a man I believe is the Broken Wheel Saloon's bouncer, someone named Briggs who has a reputation for settling disputes through intimidation. "Professional muscle," Morrison observed. "That suggests they're serious about this retrieval operation." "There's something else," Joseph continued. "They're flying a territorial marshal's warrant flag, claiming legal authority for their pursuit." Kate's stomach clenched with despair at this news. A marshal's warrant would give Harrison's men the appearance of legal authority, making it difficult for Morrison to justify protecting her without risking charges of interfering with territorial law enforcement. "How legitimate do you think that warrant might be?" Morrison asked. Joseph's smile was thin and dangerous. "About as legitimate as most legal documents that rich men purchase from corrupt officials. But it will serve their purposes if they can convince local authorities to honor it." Morrison considered their options with the methodical approach of a military commander evaluating tactical situations. "Can we verify the warrant's authenticity?" "Not without access to territorial records, and not without delays that would compromise our mission timeline." Kate realized that the moment had come for her to make the most important decision of her life. She could surrender herself to Harrison's men and spare the expedition further risk, or she could trust in the loyalty of people who barely knew her and fight for the freedom she had only just begun to taste. Captain Morrison, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. I need you to understand something. If I return to Bitter Creek with those men, I will spend the rest of my life as Harrison Blackwood's property in all but name. He will use the debt my husband owed as justification for controlling every aspect of my existence. Morrison nodded, understanding the broader implications of her situation. And if we help you evade this pursuit, then I have a chance to build a life based on my own choices rather than other people's decisions about what I deserve. Joseph stepped forward, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his back. Captain, I know this country better than anyone they could have hired to track us. I can get us through terrain that will make pursuit extremely difficult, if not impossible. At what cost to our mission timeline? Some delay, but nothing that would compromise our ability to complete the survey work before winter. Morrison made his decision with the swift confidence of a leader who understood that some situations required choosing sides regardless of potential consequences. Mrs. Sullivan, you signed on to this expedition as a valued member of our team. We protect our team members from anyone who threatens them, whether they wear badges or not. Kate felt tears of gratitude burning in her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that these men were willing to risk their professional reputations and personal safety to defend her right to self-determination. Thank you, she whispered. Thank U.S. when we've successfully outrun these bastards, Morrison replied with a grin that transformed his weathered features. Joseph, what's your plan? Joseph moved to the map case and spread out a detailed chart of the region ahead, pointing to features that would serve their purposes. We head northeast toward the Badlands country. The terrain there is broken enough to slow pursuit while providing multiple escape routes if we need them. Once we reach the northern settlements, they'll be operating outside their home territory and local support system. How long will that take? Hard riding for 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turns against us. But if we can maintain our lead and use the terrain advantages, we should be able to discourage pursuit before we reach settled country. Morrison studied the map carefully, weighing the risks against the potential benefits of Joseph's proposed route, and if they continue pursuing us despite the difficulties. Joseph's expression hardened with resolve that reminded Kate of why the Lakota had earned their reputation as formidable opponents of anyone who threatened their people. Then we make it clear that continuing to follow us would be a mistake. They might not survive to regret. The cold finality in his voice sent a shiver through Kate, but also filled her with fierce gratitude for his protection. She understood now that Joseph's offer to help her escape Bitter Creek had not been casual kindness, but a serious commitment to her welfare that he was prepared to defend with his life if necessary. They broke camp with the efficient haste of people who understood that their safety depended on speed and stealth. Kate secured her belongings and mounted her mare with hands that shook only slightly, her fear balanced by determination to prove worthy of the loyalty these men were showing her. Whatever lay ahead in the Badlands country, it had to be better than the living death that awaited her in Harrison Blackwood's version of justice. As they rode away from their campsite toward the broken country that promised either salvation or disaster, Kate looked back only once at the dust cloud that marked their pursuers' position. Then she turned her face toward the unknown territory ahead, ready to fight for the future she had chosen rather than accept the fate others had decided she deserved. The Badlands stretched before them like a landscape from another world, carved by wind and water into formations that defied easy description. Red rock spires rose from canyon floors like the fingers of buried giants, while narrow passages wound between walls that seemed to close overhead like the ribs of some massive creature. Kate had never imagined that such terrain existed, a maze of stone and shadow that promised either salvation or entrapment, depending on the skill of those who dared to navigate its complexities. Joseph guided them through this alien landscape, with the confidence of someone who had memorized every twist and turning of its hidden pathways. His knowledge of the Badlands ran deeper than mere familiarity with routes and landmarks. He seemed to understand the logic underlying its apparent chaos, reading the story written in stone by geological forces beyond human comprehension. Kate watched him work with growing admiration, recognizing that his expertise represented far more than simple trail knowledge. The horses picked their way carefully along paths that seemed to materialize and disappear, according to some pattern visible only to Joseph's trained eye. Kate's mare maintained her footing with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that trusted her rider's judgment, while the pack animals followed with the resigned patience of creatures accustomed to difficult travel. The expedition moved single file through passages barely wide enough for a mounted rider, their progress measured in yards rather than miles. Behind them, the dust cloud that marked their pursuer's position had grown steadily smaller throughout the morning, suggesting that Harrison's men were finding the terrain as challenging as Joseph had predicted. The Badlands favored those who knew their secrets while punishing the overconfident with dead ends, unstable footing, and passages that led nowhere but deeper into confusion. Kate allowed herself to hope that their lead might be sufficient to discourage further pursuit. Captain Morrison called a halt when they reached a sheltered canyon that provided water, grass for the horses, and natural defenses against anyone foolish enough to attempt an assault on their position. The walls rose nearly vertical on three sides, leaving only one approach that could be easily defended by a small number of determined riflemen. Joseph examined the site with tactical appreciation, nodding his approval of Morrison's choice. "If they want to take us here, they'll have to come through that narrow opening single file," Morrison observed, pointing to the gap that provided the only access to their sanctuary. Not a prospect that appeals to sensible men. Kate dismounted and helped Duncan establish their temporary camp, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the tension that seemed to vibrate in the air like heat rising from sun-baked stone. The work provided a welcome distraction from the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure, though she couldn't entirely forget that her presence had brought danger to people who deserved better than to be caught. In the crossfire of her escape from Bitter Creek, Joseph climbed to a vantage point that allowed him to observe the approaches to their position, using his telescope to scan for signs of their pursuers' continued advance. Kate watched him work, noting the way he seemed to become part of the landscape itself, motionless and alert as a hunting hawk. When he finally descended from his perch, his expression carried news that none of them wanted to hear. "They're still coming," he reported without preamble. 3 riders now instead of 4, which suggests they left someone behind to report their progress or summon reinforcements. "They're moving more slowly than we are, but they're not giving up." Morrison received this intelligence with the grim acceptance of a military commander who had learned to expect complications. "How much time do we have?" "They'll reach the outer edges of the Badlands by late afternoon if they maintain their current pace. After that, their progress will depend on how well they read the terrain and how much risk they're willing to accept to catch us." Kate felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on her shoulders as she contemplated the continued danger her presence represented to the expedition. "Captain Morrison, perhaps it would be better if I surrendered myself to them. You've done more than enough to help me, and I won't be responsible for anyone getting hurt on my account." Morrison's response was immediate and emphatic. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've already discussed this matter. You're under our protection, and that protection doesn't end just because the situation becomes challenging." Duncan looked up from the fire. He was building, his weathered face creased with the kind of practical concern that came from years of frontier living. "Besides, lass, giving in to bullies only encourage them to try the same tactics on the next person who refuses to knuckle under. Sometimes a stand has to be made." The simple wisdom in Duncan's words resonated with something deep in Kate's chest, a recognition that her struggle represented more than just her personal freedom. She was fighting for the principle that people should be able to choose their own paths without being crushed by those who possessed greater economic or political power. Her victory or defeat would send a message about what was possible for others in similar circumstances. Joseph joined the discussion with observations drawn from his broader understanding of territorial politics and social dynamics. Harrison Blackwood represents a type that exists in every frontier community. Men who accumulate power and use it to control others, always hiding behind legal technicalities and social conventions. If he succeeds in dragging you back to Bitter Creek, it strengthens his position and makes it harder for the next person to resist his demands. Kate nodded slowly, beginning to understand that her decision to flee had implications beyond her personal circumstances. So this is about more than just my debt to a dead husband. It's about whether people like Harrison Blackwood get to decide the fate of people like you, Morrison said bluntly. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let that happen while I have anything to say about it. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness as they waited for their pursuers to either appear or abandon their chase. Joseph maintained his watch from the canyon rim while the other men prepared defensive positions and checked their weapons. Kate occupied herself with mending tasks that kept her hands busy while her mind wrestled with the knowledge that violence might soon erupt in this peaceful sanctuary. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Joseph's sharp whistle brought everyone to immediate alertness. Kate looked up from her needlework to see him gesturing urgently from his observation post, signaling that their wait was over. Morrison and two of his men climbed quickly to join Joseph, while Duncan and the others took positions that would allow them to defend the camp if necessary. 2 riders at the canyon mouth, Joseph reported when Morrison reached his position. Samuel Blackwood and the man called Briggs. They're studying the approaches, trying to decide if they want to risk coming in after us. Morrison borrowed Joseph's telescope to examine their visitors more closely, his expression hardening as he took in details of their equipment and demeanor. Professional gunmen, he concluded grimly. This isn't going to be settled through polite conversation. Kate felt her heart racing as she contemplated the approaching confrontation, but she also felt something else stirring in her chest, a fierce determination not to be taken back to Bitter Creek against her will. She had tasted freedom during these past days of travel, had discovered aspects of herself that she never would have found in the stifling atmosphere of Harrison Blackwood's version of justice. She would not surrender that discovery without a fight. What do we do? She called up to the men on the canyon rim. Morrison's answer carried the calm authority of someone who had faced similar situations before. We make it clear that pursuing you further would be a serious mistake. The 2 riders at the canyon mouth seemed to reach some kind of decision, dismounting and securing their horses before beginning the careful climb toward the expedition's position. They moved with the tactical awareness of men experienced in violence, using available cover and maintaining separation that would make them difficult targets for defensive fire. Kate recognized Samuel Blackwood's pale features and nervous mannerisms, though his companion remained a stranger whose reputation for brutality preceded him into the canyon. Morrison cupped his hands and called down to the approaching men, his voice echoing off the stone walls with commanding authority. "That's far enough, gentlemen. State your business." Samuel's response carried the shrill confidence of someone backed by legal documents and family connections. "We're here on official territorial business, pursuing a fugitive who fled lawful debt collection procedures. Surrender Kate Sullivan immediately or face charges of interfering with territorial law enforcement." "Let's see that warrant," Morrison replied, though his tone suggested he had little faith in its legitimacy. Samuel held up a folded document, waving it like a battle flag. "Signed and sealed by Territorial Marshal Wade Hendricks, authorizing the recovery of the debtor Kate Sullivan and any property she may have unlawfully removed from Bitter Creek." Joseph descended from the rim to confer quietly with Morrison, his expression dark with anger. "Marshal Hendricks is Harrison Blackwood's brother-in-law," he whispered. "That warrant is about as legitimate as a $3 bill, but it will serve their purposes if they can avoid close examination." Morrison nodded grimly, understanding the corruption that had produced their current predicament. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called down to Kate, "do you recognize the authority of this warrant?" Kate stood up from her position beside the fire, her voice carrying clearly through the canyon as she addressed the men who had come to drag her back to captivity. "I recognize no authority that serves only the interests of men like Harrison Blackwood. I left Bitter Creek of my own free will, and I'll return only under the same circumstances." Samuel's face flushed with frustrated anger at her defiant response. "You don't have a choice in the matter, woman. You're coming back with us whether you want to or not." "Actually," Morrison called down, "she does have a choice, and so do you. You can turn around and ride out of here peacefully, or you can try to take her by force and discover how that works out for you." Briggs spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat menace of a man comfortable with violence. "There are only 6 of you up there, and more men following behind us. You can't protect her forever." Joseph's reply cut through the canyon air like a blade. "We don't need forever. We just need long enough for you to understand that continuing this pursuit will cost more than you're prepared to pay." The standoff stretched taut as both sides evaluated their options and the potential consequences of escalation. Kate found herself holding her breath, aware that the next few moments would determine whether she lived as a free woman or died as one. She had no illusions about what would happen if she returned to Bitter Creek under these circumstances. Harrison Blackwood would ensure that she never again had the opportunity to defy his authority. Samuel seemed to realize that his position was weaker than he had anticipated, despite the warrant that supposedly gave him legal authority. The canyon's defensive advantages heavily favored the expedition, and Morrison's men had the look of soldiers who would not hesitate to use their weapons if pressed. He exchanged nervous glances with Briggs, clearly hoping his companion would provide the aggressive leadership that his own courage couldn't supply. Briggs studied the tactical situation with professional assessment, calculating odds and potential casualties with the cold mathematics of someone who made his living through violence. Whatever conclusion he reached apparently didn't favor immediate assault, because he gestured for Samuel to withdraw to a position where they could confer without being overheard by their intended targets. Kate watched the 2 men huddle in urgent conversation, their gestures and expressions revealing the strain of trying to solve a problem that had no easy solutions. Samuel appeared to be arguing for continued pressure, while Briggs seemed to favor reassessing their approach, though the details of their disagreement remained beyond earshot. Joseph used the respite to position himself where he could observe both the immediate threat and the canyon approaches, his rifle ready but not yet aimed in an overtly threatening manner. The other expedition members took similar defensive positions, creating overlapping fields of fire that would make any assault extremely costly for the attackers. "Mrs. Sullivan," Morrison called softly, "if shooting starts, you stay low and let us handle the situation. Understood?" Kate nodded, though she privately resolved that she would not cower helplessly while others fought for her freedom. She retrieved Thomas's old pistol from her travel bag, checking to ensure it was properly loaded despite her limited experience with firearms. If violence erupted, she intended to contribute to her own defense rather than remaining a passive observer of others' courage. The consultation between Samuel and Briggs concluded with what appeared to be a compromise solution. They returned to their previous position, and Samuel raised his voice to address the expedition once more, though his tone now carried less certainty than before. "We're prepared to negotiate a settlement that addresses everyone's concerns," he announced. "Mrs. Sullivan can satisfy her obligations to Mayor Blackwood, through alternative arrangements that don't require her physical return to Bitter Creek. Morrison's laugh carried no humor whatsoever. And what alternative arrangements would those be? Assignment of her property rights in compensation for the debt, plus a formal agreement not to interfere with Bitter Creek's business relationships in the future. Kate felt anger rising in her chest like floodwater behind a failing dam. You want me to sign away everything I own and promise never to compete with Harrison's commercial interests in exchange for the privilege of being allowed to leave town? It's a generous offer considering the circumstances, Samuel replied. Defensively. It's theft disguised as legal procedure, Morrison said flatly. And the answer is no. Briggs stepped forward, his patience apparently exhausted by the failure of diplomatic solutions. Enough talking. We're taking her back with us, and anyone who tries to stop us will answer for it. The threat hung in the canyon air like the scent of gunpowder, transforming the standoff from tense negotiation to imminent violence. Kate felt time slowing as she watched both sides prepare for combat that would determine her fate once and for all. Joseph's rifle came up to his shoulder with fluid grace, the barrel centered on Briggs's chest. I don't think so, he said quietly. Morrison and his men followed Joseph's lead, their weapons trained on the two intruders with professional precision. The canyon that had seemed like a peaceful sanctuary moments earlier now resembled a killing ground where the slightest miscalculation could trigger a massacre. Samuel's nerve finally broke under the pressure of multiple rifle barrels pointed in his direction. This isn't over, he snarled as he began backing toward the canyon mouth. Harrison won't forget this insult, and neither will Territorial Marshal Hendricks. Tell Harrison that Kate Sullivan is under the protection of people who don't intimidate. Easily, Morrison replied. And tell your marshal that his jurisdiction doesn't extend to places where his corruption isn't recognized. Briggs retreated more slowly than his companion, his eyes never leaving the expedition members who tracked his movement with steady aim. When he reached the horses, he turned back for one final threat. You can't watch her forever, he called. Sooner or later, she'll be alone, and when that happens, we'll collect what's owed. Joseph's response carried the cold finality of a promise carved in stone. If anything happens to her, I'll hold you personally responsible. And my people have long memories for unpaid debts. The two riders mounted their horses and disappeared into the Badlands, leaving behind only dust and the echo of threats that would have to be taken seriously despite their failure to achieve immediate success. Kate felt her knees trembling with relief and delayed fear, the adrenaline that had sustained her during the confrontation, now leaving her system in a rush that made her feel weak and dizzy. Morrison climbed down from his observation post and approached Kate with the concerned expression of a commander checking on his troops after battle. How are you holding up, Mrs. Sullivan? Kate managed a shaky smile that felt like the first genuine expression of happiness she had worn in years. I'm free, she said simply. For the first time in my adult life, I'm actually free. Joseph joined them, his rifle still ready but no longer aimed at immediate threats. Free but not safe, he cautioned. Harrison Blackwood won't give up easily, and men like Briggs make their living by carrying out threats that other people make. What do you recommend? Morrison asked. Joseph considered their options with the tactical mindset of someone accustomed to planning survival in hostile territory. We push hard for the northern settlements and get Mrs. Sullivan established in a community strong enough to discourage retaliation. Once she's surrounded by people who value her contributions, harassment becomes much more difficult. Kate felt tears of gratitude burning her eyes as she contemplated the loyalty these men continued to show despite the dangers her presence had brought upon them. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered. Thank us by building the life you deserve. Morrison replied gruffly. That's the only thanks we need. Duncan emerged from his defensive position with the practical concern of someone focused on immediate necessities. We should break camp and move while we still have daylight. Those boys might come back with reinforcements, and I'd rather not be here to greet them. The expedition packed their gear with the efficient haste of people who understood that safety lay in movement rather than fortification. Kate secured her belongings and mounted her mare with hands that no longer trembled, her fear replaced by determination to prove worthy of the protection she had received. As they rode deeper into the Badlands toward whatever future awaited in the northern settlements, Kate looked back only once at the canyon where she had finally stood up for herself. The place would always hold special meaning for her, marking the moment when she stopped running from her circumstances and started fighting for her right to choose a different path. 3 days later, they crested a ridge that revealed the first of the northern settlements spread along a valley floor that promised prosperity and peace. Kate studied the neat buildings and cultivated fields below, seeing not just a destination, but a place where she could begin the process of becoming whoever she chose to be. Joseph guided his horse closer to hers, his expression warm with satisfaction at having successfully completed his self-appointed mission. "What do you think?" Kate smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time since before Thomas's death. "I think it looks like home." 6 months later, Kate Sullivan stood in the doorway of her own shop in the town of Pine Ridge Crossing, watching the morning sun paint the mountains gold and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Her seamstress business thrived in a community that valued skill over social connections, and her friendship with Joseph had deepened into something that promised lasting happiness. The sign above her door reads Sullivan's Fine Tailoring, the painted letters bright and proud against freshly whitewashed wood. Below it, a smaller sign announced, Alterations, Custom Work, and Cultural Exchange Welcome, advertising her willingness to work with both European and Native American styles. The combination had proven popular with the diverse population of Pine Ridge Crossing, where people judged each other by their actions rather than their ancestry. Harrison Blackwood had never followed through on his threats, perhaps recognizing that his authority diminished with distance from Bitter Creek. Samuel had appeared once in Pine Ridge Crossing, making inquiries about Kate's business and legal status, but the town's sheriff had made it clear that outsiders with questionable warrants weren't welcome to cause trouble for established residents. Kate no longer thought of herself as the desperate woman who had fled Bitter Creek in fear and desperation. She had become someone who owned her own shop, contributed to her community's welfare, and made decisions based on her own judgment rather than other people's expectations. Most importantly, she had learned that respect was something to be earned rather than granted, and that earning it was far more satisfying than simply receiving it as a social courtesy. Joseph visited regularly, their relationship deepening with each shared conversation and collaborative project. He had begun talking about building a permanent home in Pine Ridge Crossing, a prospect that filled Kate with anticipation for the future they might create together. Their courtship proceeded at a pace that honored both of their cultural backgrounds while creating something entirely new. As Kate prepared to open her shop for another day of meaningful work, she reflected on the transformation that had begun. With a simple refusal to accept limitations imposed by others, she had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, and that freedom was not something granted by authority, but something claimed through personal determination. The bell above her door chimed as her first customer of the day entered, a young woman seeking alterations for a wedding dress. Kate welcomed her with the genuine warmth of someone who had learned to appreciate the simple pleasure of work that mattered in a place where she belonged, surrounded by people who saw her worth. Kate Sullivan had finally found her place in the world, not by accepting what others offered, but by insisting on what she deserved. And every day, that place felt more like home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.